So good evening, everyone. I'm Clyde Wilcox. I'm the acting dean, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion. This panel is the second event that we've held to highlight the research conducted under the CIRS project Football in the Middle East, the outcome of which is a new book edited by Professor Abdullah Al-Arian, published by Hurst, Oxford University Press. Makes wonderful gifts. Pick a dozen up on your way out. Tonight's panel will be moderated by Suzi Mirgani, Assistant Director of Publications at CIRS, and we'll explore how football is affecting states, governments, and societies across the region. I hand it over to Suzi, who can introduce the guests.
Thank you, Dean Wilcox. So I'm going to start off with some boring stuff, which is our housekeeping notes. So phones off, please, or on silent, if you don't mind. We hope that more people will come, so I think there's plenty of space so you don't have to scoot over. Recording of today's event will be uploaded to our YouTube channel very soon, and please make sure, if you haven't already signed up to our mailing list, to sign up or to follow our social media. We're CIRS at CIRS GUQ. And after the discussion, as usual, we'll have a reception outside, so please join us. And finally, our book that we will be discussing today, Football in the Middle East, is available for purchase at the GUQ bookstore. So allow me to introduce our guests. Abdullah Al-Arian is Associate Professor of History at Georgetown University in Qatar, and he is the editor of our book on football in the Middle East, State, Society, and the Beautiful Game. He's also an author of a chapter in the book titled Beyond Soft Power, Football as a Form of Regime Legitimation. And we have Niki, so we have a hybrid event today. Niki Akhavan, Associate Professor and Chair of the Media and Communication Studies Department at the Catholic University of America. She's author of the book Electronic Iran, The Cultural Politics of an Online Evolution. And the book chapter in our book, To See and Be Seen, Football, Media, and Social Change in Iran. And then finally, last but not least, we have Craig LaMay, who is a journalist and professor in residence at Northwestern University in Qatar. He serves as director of the Journalism and Strategic Communication Program. He is author of the book chapter, Qatar's beIN Sports and Football Broadcasting in the Middle East, International Influence and Regional Rancor. That's a great title. So, to start with, I'll be asking all of our speakers one round of questions, and then we'll be opening it up to the floor. So we'll start with Professor Al-Arian. So in your recent work, you argue that soft power analyses are not sufficient to explain the connection between states in the Middle East and football. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, thank you. So the way that I came to this topic was through mostly just like many of you, I'm sure, who've been following a lot of the stories about the World Cup, but also just the general subject of football in the Middle East. I'm sure for the better part of the last decade, all of us have been reading the stories, the analyses, a lot of them kind of coming our way through the media, but also even in kind of scholarly discussions about football in the Middle East. And we always come back to this question of soft power, that because of obviously the role that especially the Gulf states have had in terms of buying major European clubs or having these massive kit sponsorship deals, or obviously hosting mega events, things like not just the World Cup, but even a number of global tournaments and state tournaments that we've seen, that all of this has been kind of just reduced down to this question of soft power, that these countries are just doing this as a way of kind of branding themselves in an international relations environment, kind of within that context. And to me, that analysis always rang a bit superficial. It seemed to me that there was a lot more going on than just simple national branding. And so if we go back to the origin, or the definition, we should say, of the term. So soft power is this concept that comes along particularly as an explanatory tool after the end of the Cold War, once there was a sense that we're in this kind of unipolar moment, and states don't have to rely on a kind of active projection of power through their militaries, that there's this concept of soft power in which, and I'll just kind of read this kind of textbook definition. It's the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. It arises from the attractiveness of a country's culture, political ideals, and policies. So the problem with that is that when you just take this category of culture, that anything that comes out of culture then gets reduced to the concept of soft power. So a country that uses its music industry or its film industry, or even in this case, things having to do with sports and looking specifically at the question of football, that it just becomes soft power because this is just simply a way, as the definition says, to attract others to you. But I think when I really look at what's happening in this region in particular, one of the things that really comes across is that a lot of the states here, of course, are authoritarian regimes that we're talking about, and they're using their footballing interests or instrumentalizing them in a way that is really intending more than anything else to try to legitimize themselves. I mean, again, there's many different functions, but more than anything else, it's about regime legitimation. And so I kind of dug a little bit into that literature. I won't bore you with the theoretical aspects of the chapter, but I will say that I kind of came across a number of different, what I would consider kind of categories in terms of how this process plays out, that looking at a number of these regional powers or regimes, and the way that they tended to use their footballing interests primarily to legitimize their own governments. Why football? Well, I think we all know the answer to that. Obviously, this is kind of taking something that is universally loved, for which most of their populations have a very deep passion for, and of which has massive global appeal and even kind of marketability if we're kind of looking at it in terms of the economic component of this as well. And so for all of those reasons, football is a very convenient way to try to do for these governments what they can't do through other means. And so what are the different types of examples that I look at? And I take some of these kind of historically, really over the last kind of 2 decades or so. But one actually is not the case of just a simple authoritarian case, but I actually look at a very interesting story that takes us all the way back to the 2004 Olympic Games, in which Iraq, unbeknownst to kind of most observers at the time, makes it all the way to the semifinal match, despite the fact that the country was still very much under US occupation and was very much, of course, suffering from tremendous militant violence and kind of the complete fracturing of the country there. And one of the interesting things, of course, is that the Bush administration had led this deeply unpopular kind of war of choice in Iraq and was trying to kind of take what was a deeply unpopular war and try to kind of find a way to instrumentalize it for its own purposes. And so in 2004, at a time when George Bush was running for his re-election campaign, he actually made a number of TV advertisements and used the success of the Iraqi national football team as a way to kind of have people kind of come around on the question of the invasion of Iraq. In fact, at one point when it was the possibility that the Iraqi team might end up in the final match, the gold medal match in the Olympics, he even had his aides kind of ask whether he could be in attendance. He would fly to Greece for that match, and he even asked whether the Iraqi team would hold the Afghan flag alongside the Iraqi flag, just to kind of piece together the US invasions of both countries. The ads that were on TV at the time would say things like, well, previously we had 2 terrorist countries, and this year we have 2 more free countries, meaning Iraq. And of course, they would have the picture of the Iraqi national football team. And then the media played its part too. And so I have this quote from a Washington Post column at the time that says, "No doubt the coalition government back home would like them being, of course, the football team, to represent the new Iraq, one that's free of torture and corruption, an Iraq that's not particularly ethnic or too radically religious, a national icon and a rallying point that's not a mosque." The idea, of course, again, being to try to kind of reimagine the image of what Iraq represents, both in the American imagination, but also in terms of trying to kind of refashion the consensus or the kind of governing opinion around the Iraq invasion at a time when it was, again, if we remember back to that time when the war was far from settled. This was very much after Bush's infamous mission accomplished speech, when we know, of course, that things were far less than settled in terms of the occupation. And so this is, at least in some ways, an attempt to legitimize the ongoing coalition government there. But I have a number of other examples that I'll share, at least a few of them. I think one that really comes to mind is the legitimization of a transition plan of power, that the succession plan for a number of these authoritarian governments was very much tied to the question of football. I think one case in particular is that of Egypt in the lead up to the 2010 World Cup. There was a final playoff match between Egypt and Algeria, and all of a sudden, and I remember I was in Cairo at the time, and one of the things that you noticed immediately was the kind of very violent rhetoric that was coming out. And again, we know that fans confront one another, and there's incidents of fan violence. But what was strange about this particular moment is the fact that this was actually being egged on by the government, that it was state media, it was the radio stations, it was even the family of Hosni Mubarak, the president of Egypt at the time, that was very much engaging in this. And it seemed more as the days kind of counted down until the final match between Algeria and Egypt, that this was really about positioning Gamal Mubarak as the kind of heir apparent to his father. And there was kind of all the signs that you imagine, the kind of the language and the sort of figurative speech having to do with war and violence and the kind of incredibly anti-Algerian animosity. There was kind of the destruction of Algerian businesses. There was the attack on the Algerian team bus. They had to move the match ultimately to Sudan, to a neutral site where it would be played, in part to avoid that kind of violence, and yet you still heard of instances there. And of course, we saw this on both sides, on the Algerian side as well, but I focus a lot more on what was happening in Egypt as a means of kind of legitimating Gamal Mubarak, who of course would also show up in the stadium, kind of, standing in the crowd, sort of looking like a general leading his country into war. And there was something about this practice that was kind of very much in the mindset of a military regime that was lacking a military successor, right? Gamal Mubarak doesn't come out of the military, and so all of the kind of imagery of the military that was used in this case to support the football team. There was the other example, of course, which was in Egypt later on in 2018. For those of you who followed what happened with the Egyptian football team then, it had a really miserable showing. They lost all 3 of their group stage matches. They didn't have a single point. They finished bottom of their group. And a lot of the kind of after, the kind of next day analysis of what happened to the Egyptian team had to do with the fact that this was very much the World Cup campaign in 2018 was used to try and legitimize the Sisi regime. Again, this is just barely 5 years since the coup that took place that brought Abdel Fattah al-Sisi to power. Things were still quite tenuous. There was still a lot of kind of violence and opposition and kind of an inability to legitimize that regime. And so there was a kind of trying to seize on the World Cup campaign. And so everything from stationing the Egyptian camp in Chechnya, where they were kind of being paraded around by the local warlord there, Radman Kadyrov, and taking them out at odd hours of the night. Maybe some of you saw those videos that went viral of Mohammed Salah kind of being taken out of his hotel none of that was conducive to having a kind of a proper camp, let alone a good performance in the World Cup. There was also reports that celebrities and politicians and people from Egypt were kind of paying their way to go stay in the team hotel and be able to kind of say that they were with the team at a time when, of course, it probably should have been isolated from all of that. And a lot of this was very much driven by the Egyptian Football Association, which, of course, had already given its staunch endorsement of Sisi during the previous elections, even going against the kind of very basic FIFA statute, which says that this would be a violation to take sides in a political discussion. Another example has to do with instrumentalizing football to ward off specific threats. And I think we saw this especially with Qatar during the 2017 summer of the blockade, that as soon as the quartet of countries launched the blockade, there was a response in part among the many different kinds of responses that also had to do with positioning the kind of branding that we see specifically with the PSG team as kind of being a stand-in or representative of Qatar. We saw with the transfer market that kind of ballooned out of control with the purchase of Neymar, not just the 222 million release clause, but the 300 million that was ultimately paid in part to sign him up as a spokesperson for the Qatar World Cup. We saw it later on as well, with the acquisition of Mbappe, which later turned into a $180 million acquisition. Again, all of these to say that this was a means of kind of circumventing some of the challenges that have to do with what the blockade represented in terms of attempting to isolate Qatar. The other example has to do with the securitization measures, and this has to do mostly with the United Arab Emirates, but all of the countries engaged in this to a certain degree. The UAE during the same period in terms of the counter-revolution during the period of not just the blockade, but really of the Arab uprisings overall, was leveraging its position in European football specifically to try to call on the UK government to conduct investigations of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and to kind of crack down on exiled activists in the UK, specifically using the board members and the chairman specifically of Manchester City. And so again, this was another instance. And then just finally, I'll mention, to wrap up, is this question of sports washing. I mean, it's a term we probably hear quite a bit nowadays. I'm sometimes a bit hesitant to use it only because I feel like it tries to explain too many things, but I think there are certain cases where it's very applicable or very fitting. In this case, I think Saudi Arabia, which is a country that historically has not had as much of an investment in football as we've seen from many other countries in this region, but more recently has begun to host tournaments. The Spanish Cup, the Italian Cup were all hosted in Saudi over the last couple of years. In addition to, of course, the most high-profile recent development is the purchase of Newcastle FC. And again, all of this being seen in part to deflect attention away from the kind of gross human rights abuses that we see Saudi engaged in, whether it's the Khashoggi killing, whether it's the war in Yemen, whether it's the crackdown domestically against activists and people within Saudi Arabia itself. So there's a lot that we can kind of add on, but I guess I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, we'll move on to Dr. Akhavan. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes, okay, great. So Iran has a very active women's movement, but at the same time, women have been barred from football stadiums in Iran. So can you tell us what are the political and cultural developments that have made football and football broadcasting as well important sites for the fight for gender equality?
Sure. First, thank you for having me, and I wish I were there, especially after I heard you guys have a reception after the event, but it's wonderful to be here. To answer your question, the ban on women's attendance in the stadium, it goes all the way back to 1981, shortly after the Iranian Revolution, and this was not a one-off policy. It was coextensive with various public policies that governed how women could appear in public, where they could go, and so on. But for about 2 decades, there was very little action on this front in terms of women pursuing the stadium issue as a main agenda. We can talk about why those 2 decades were quiet, maybe in the question and answer session. Some of it has to do with the war and the post-war recovery, but I can identify maybe 3 or 4 interrelated developments that made it such that football attendance became at the forefront of women's rights activism inside Iran. And the first one that I would outline is the media one, developments particularly in digital media and digital media communications, which in the early 2000s, in the case of Iran and actually worldwide, was the rise of the blogosphere. The Iranian blogosphere was among the most active in the early 2000s. At one point, Persian was the 3rd most used language on the entire blogosphere. And this development, it provided women with the capacity, and ordinary citizens, not just women, with making interventions in the public discourse in ways that they had not before. And one of the examples that I cite in the early 2000s, well, actually, let me first tell you the 4 areas, and then I'll go into my examples. So first is the media sphere. The second is is more related to international audiences and the ability of women to address international audiences, and also an international interest in Iran via other spheres such as film festival circuits, international foreign-funded Persian language broadcasts, and the like. The third is the involvement of international governing bodies of football, but again, this is initiated by Iranian women. They're the ones that ask the governing bodies to get involved. I think this gets overlooked, especially in terms of recent developments, but those are the 3 interrelated areas. So going back to the first one, the rise of the blogosphere and rise of digital media, the example I cite in the chapter is the 2005 Iran-Bahrain qualifying game for the World Cup. This was a case where women had gathered outside the stadium in sizable numbers, demanding to be let in. Women have been going to games, by the way, but undercover, dressed as boys. There's a whole other phenomenon related to that I can speak to as well. But this is the case where women dressed as women went and demanded to be let into the stadium, and they made such a big stink that the sports minister at the time, in fact, let some in and let them attend in the VIP section. This was a big victory for the women, but also the minister tried to twist it in terms of taking credit for letting the women in. But the point is the fact that women were able to make this demand and then later capture their own experience in their own blogs and be their own voice, to use a cliche, made a big difference. And they were also able to counteract the state's attempts to take credit for having let women in this case, the minister taking credit for that. So we have that, the rise of what we now call social media, then called new media, and digital communications in general. The second is this rise to what I mentioned as the shift to the international sphere, the ability for Iranian women activists to engage in international sphere, which is not just related to social media. If some members of your audience may know, and you may know yourself, that starting in the late 90s on, Iranian cinema started to make a splash on the international festival circuit, and a number of figures that became prominent in this festival circuit, most famous of which was Jack Akhavan. He made this film called Offside in 2006. This was a story of, again, women dressing as boys to get into the game. That won many accolades. That was a film that actually got permits to film inside the country, but then once the film was made, it was banned from showing. So it really only garnered international audience, but it became yet another platform where this issue of women's attendance was gaining more traction. And the third, and I think the most important decision probably in terms of a strategy by the women's rights movement, started back in the early 2000s in a systematic way, was to actually reach out to the sports governing bodies, whether it was FIFA or whether it was the Asian Football Confederation. And that's from that moment on, really 2005 on, is where you see this active engagement and international governing bodies actually making demands on the Iranian state to include women and allow them to attend the games. When I submitted the chapter, the last thing I had talked about, I think, was the 2019 qualifying game between Iran and Cambodia. And that was a case where women were let in. There was a lot of hoopla around it, both inside the country and outside the country, and of course by women talking about their own experiences. And in that chapter, I had lamented the fact that it's not over, women still can't attend the domestic league games. But this changed just in the last 3 weeks. So the last week of August, there were 2 league games, the most popular league games. Tehran's 2 rival teams played in 2 different games, and women were allowed to attend that game. And once again, that brought with it a wave of internal and external coverage. And you saw all those elements working together. The digital media, the international audience that was attuned to it, and the fact that, again, this was a demand, an explicit demand by FIFA as part of longer negotiations related actually to the Qatar games that allowed for women to attend. So that's really, in a nutshell, the main developments that, again, I would have to put the agency on the women's activists who have pushed this. And I should also clarify that there have been criticisms of women activists around this particular issue because, why football? There's a million other things to pursue. And I think it has to do, there's a strategy to it. There are women activists who will acknowledge, yes, we are using this issue to push forward other issues. But there is, in terms of fandom, there is a true fan base among Iranian women who really just want to see the games, whether or not it is related to these other demands. That is actually a core part of what they want. And so I think we can see it on 2 levels. One, it's about the game, it's about being able to attend the game, but it's also a reflection or a symbol of other limitations that have been put on Iranian women, and this becomes a way to push that agenda forward in in an arena that can get you a bigger audience, and it doesn't just become a woman's issue, because you can tap into sports fandom, you can tap into all kinds of other spaces. So I think I'll end there because I think that's my 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Akhavan. And now we're going to bring it home. We're going to bring it to Qatar. Dr. LaMay, can you tell us a little bit more about the beIN Sports Network, the connections between the World Cup and beIN's dominance?
Absolutely, thank you. By the way, I'm not a doctor, but I have been identified as one on TV. That must count for something. No, I'm just a journalist, and I became very interested in beIN. I teach media law, and I became very interested in beIN a few years ago when, shortly after the blockade began, many of you remember the world's largest incident of state-sponsored industrial piracy began here, when Saudi Arabia began to pirate the beIN signal and distribute it on the Arabsat satellite. And that went on for 3.5 years, and it was not just beIN that was pirated. It would go out to beIN, and it had a monitoring station. By 2019, GUQ, as this station was called, was pirating 1,300 channels around the world, including any sports channel you can name, from Sky to ESPN to Fox Sports to the Big Ten Network, which of course is my school. And it was extraordinary. At some point, it came off the Arabsat distribution and was distributed by Internet Protocol Television throughout the region. And it completely disrupted the global sports rights market for the simple reason that when you buy sports rights, you buy them on an exclusive basis. If they're not exclusive, they're not worth anything. And so beIN, this whole thing came to an end in 2021, and beIN has said publicly that it's going to be more prudent in its future acquisition of sports rights. But to Suzi's question, what makes beIN so important is that it's the world's largest sports broadcaster. It has, both by rights under contract, $15 billion, and its distribution. It operates on every continent except Antarctica, either on its own or with partners. And so you couple that with the World Cup, which is by far the world's biggest media event. Some 5 billion people are expected to watch some part of the Cup. That's quite a combination. So the interest, when I look at beIN, one of the questions I have, this kind of goes to Abdullah's discussion. When we did this same group did a book on sports in the Middle East 4 years ago that Daniel edited. And I remember when we did a book event then, here at Georgetown, an elderly Qatari gentleman stood up in the Q&A and asked, and I'm quoting him, his whole question was, is the $200 billion worth it? And there's a lot of ways to unpack that $200 billion figure. But you know, if you look at the actual cost of the World Cups previous in Russia and Brazil, the Russian World Cup was estimated to cost $14 billion, and the Brazilian World Cup $11 billion. Obviously, a lot of the $200 billion we're talking about here is all kinds of infrastructure development. If you live here, I don't need to explain that to you. And a lot of that has real legacy value. But it's still a lot of money that's going to be spent on these World Cups, building, in addition, not only refurbishing Khalifa Stadium, but building 7 more, including the one down the street from us. And so when you unpack this gentleman's question about is the $200 billion worth it, some part of that has to include beIN. One of the things that makes beIN interesting is that no one thinks it's profitable. Now, it doesn't publish its financial data, of course. It's not a publicly traded company in any way that I'm familiar with it. So the best way to figure out what it spends and what it earns is through following the trade press. And the general estimates are that it loses about $200 million a year. It's not profitable. It depends very much on who you ask. I saw an interview the other day with the president of beIN's Asian Pacific operations, where it really operates almost by itself. It used to compete with Disney in that market, and Disney decided that pay television, which is what beIN, was not the sports distribution platform of the future, so they pulled out. But that gentleman said that there's no one to contest this, that beIN is, quote, profitable and here to stay. Now, one of the questions I've always heard about beIN, which I think is just wrong-headed, is that it's just a soft power operation. It's just a flash in the pan, it'll go away. You wouldn't look, if you looked at the operation that it has, no one would think that. It's quite extensive. And in many markets, including the United States, nobody has any idea what beIN is or where it comes from. They know what Al Jazeera is, but they don't know what beIN is. And in the United States, for example, where beIN broadcasts, it's broadcasts mostly South American football, and so that's to a very particular audience. The other remarkable thing about beIN, I think, is that if you look at the 10 largest sports rights markets in the world, the biggest by far is the US for lots of reasons, but entirely because of beIN, the MENA region is now 8th. And that's because, are any of you, I don't know if any of you are beIN subscribers or beIN Connect subscribers, but if you want to watch football here, you watch beIN. It has had, until the piracy began, it had the rights to all 5 of the major European leagues, the UEFA championships, FIFA, Turkish football, South American football, we can go down the list. Every premium football property it had. And indeed, during the first thing it did when the blockade began and the piracy began was to triple its offer for the UEFA championships, making that the most valuable property in the market. The other interesting thing about beIN is when you look at it, its most valuable property is not a domestic one. It is the European football. Again, the problem is that no credible industry watcher thinks the business is profitable, yet it's not going to go away. So the question I have, I'm actually owe you guys a paper on this, is what is the future of beIN going to be in this market and elsewhere? And will Qatar continue to support it as it has? I, of course, don't know. I try to talk to folks at beIN all the time. If you're a reporter here, you know it's a difficult proposition. But one of the things that I caught my eye, I wrote about this for Dana recently, is that 2 weeks ago, the IMF announced that because of the war in Ukraine, the 3 Gulf states, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, will see an extra $1.3 trillion in energy revenues flow into this region in the next 4 years. And that's going to buy a lot of football. And when you look at these sports mega events like the World Cup or the Olympics, you might have seen that, I think it was yesterday or at least this week, Saudi Arabia announced that it will make a bid for the 2030 World Cup in partnership with Egypt and Greece, and Saudi, of course, will pay for it. And the Saudi Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is now at $62 billion, is supposed to grow to $2 trillion rather, by 2030. When you look at these sport mega events, they're fabulously expensive. Russia's not going to host another one in my lifetime. The West generally is concerned with inflation, high energy prices, and China itself is having its own economic problems. Who can afford these things? The next few iterations of the World Cup and the Olympics are actually in Australia, North America, and Europe. But after that, I think it's a reasonable bet that they will come to this region. The other interesting thing, and Abdullah mentioned this too, is 4 or 5 years ago, when we did that first book, we had a discussion about Saudi Arabia, which is literally the sleeping giant in this market. It's 40% of the sports rights market here. When it disappeared because of piracy, that was a huge loss to beIN. It was lost revenues. And the question was, well, will they ever kind of wake up and really become a player in this market? Well, they began to a few years ago when they've invested heavily in their domestic sports sector, in sports that appeal to their overwhelmingly young population. So esports, drone racing, Formula One, WWE, UFC. And now they're moving into international sports markets. So Abdullah mentioned the purchase of Newcastle United, which they tried to do during the piracy, but you can't have a known pirate being an owner in your league. That just doesn't look good. But they succeeded, last year. And then any of you who are golfers, first of all, I feel bad for you. But secondly, you might know that one of the big sports stories of last summer was that Saudi Arabia is literally trying to buy the sport of golf by offering massive payouts to the world's top golfers. The giant in the golf rights market is the US PGA Tour, which is 52% of the market. And they're literally trying to take that away. And then you add to it its intention to bid for the Olympics and the World Cup. It'll be very interesting to see what Saudi Arabia does. It began a rights acquisition platform in 2020 to start to buy media rights. It's folks that, again, they're mostly on the domestic market, but it could certainly, if it wanted to, mount some sort of competition to be in. How this will all work out, we'll see. But it's a really fascinating sports rights market to study. And what happens here, as I told you, has significant consequences for sports rights markets everywhere.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And thank you also for mentioning our blog on our website. If you're more interested in football and its relationship to politics and society, Building a Legacy, our faculty lead is Professor Daniel Reiche, and we have lots of blogs and podcasts and so on, so please check it out.
So hello, thank you very much for the talk. So far you've discussed that sports teams and sports clubs are really a reflection and manifestation of state power. But has there ever been cases in the Arab context wherein these sports teams and sports clubs functioned as independent political entities that played a larger role in the regional political context? Thank you.
Are you addressing someone in particular, yes?
Anyone.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't want to give the impression that football in this region is simply the domain of states. I think that's certainly the angle that we're all taking because that just happens to be the theme for tonight's event. But I think one of the things that comes across, I think, from all of our comments, if I can speak for my co-panelists here, is the fact that this is a site of contention, right? That this is not simply just states who are exerting all of their influence on football, but football itself exists as a kind of a site of contestation between various forces within society, within the kind of realm of corporate or business elites, and of course the state is just one of many actors. We're all focused obviously on the role of the state because it happens to be quite massive, especially in this region, but that's not to suggest that there isn't a fight going on. And I think, again, going back to my own paper, I think one of the things that I argue is actually every one of these case examples that I look at is that it ultimately ends in failure, right? That every time the state is trying to use football to legitimize itself, it ultimately doesn't succeed. And that's for a number of different reasons, part of which, of course, is that you can't simply use sports to cover up the massive structural inequalities and injustices that exist within those societies. And on another level, you can also say that because football exists outside of the ability of a power as powerful as the state to be able to wield control over it. And I think we've seen, I mean, again, hopefully one of these days we'll have yet another panel and we'll bring many other panelists or contributors from the book who can tell you all about the fact that football has also been utilized as a source of mobilization by populations. You know, we have a chapter on the role of football in the Hirak movement in Algeria, which was attempting to overthrow a dictatorship just in the last couple of years. And then many, many other examples. But I think it's fair to say that it's very much a site of contention between all of these different actors.
May I add to that one?
Go ahead.
This is a subject that fascinates me as an American. We think of sports in a different way, but when you look at football and politics in this region, everything from the FLN football team in Algeria that played for years under a flag and an anthem that didn't exist before independence in 1962, and then more recently was there for the Gezi Park protests in Istanbul, where the ultras from I can't even pronounce the names, but Galatasaray and Beşiktaş, who would otherwise go after each other, came to the aid of protesters who went after the police against the Erdogan government. It's this kind of political mobilization of football is one of the really interesting things about the sport.
Thank you. We have another question at the back there.
Hi, yeah. So this is a question for Professor Arian. So you mentioned about states mobilizing sports as a way of weaponizing sports to advance their foreign policy, cover up their crimes and all that. So I feel that this is a violation of sports' first principle, which is sports is apolitical, so there's no politics in sports. In the case that, say, a football team is backed by the state to do these things, do you think that these football teams deserve to be banned from attending international competitions So say a football team is clearly backed by a dictator to push a certain message to the world. Should that team be banned from competing in international tournaments?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, I would probably push back a little bit on the first part of your statement, the idea that anything is apolitical, because I think there's a political element that's kind of underwriting everything, whether we're talking about kind of elite sports, that you can't really escape the political. But I think the real question is not whether it can be political or apolitical, but rather how is it that you enforce that politics, right? Is it in a way that is furthering, as you say, the aims of authoritarian regimes that are very much complicit in the repression of society? So again, I mean, for all of the talk about, for the sake of argument, thinking about, the Qatar World Cup and people specifically looking at it in the shadow of all of the criticisms. I mean, the 1978 World Cup in Argentina was happening while the country was under a military junta that was disappearing thousands of people into camps and executions and so forth, and yet those games happened kind of at the forefront of all of these other horrors that were taking place there at the time. So it is interesting, at least, to think about kind of where are those decisions made and where are those boundaries drawn. I think we've all watched, for instance, as Russia has been suspended from all kind of international competitions. All the Russian clubs have been kicked out of UEFA as well. So there's something to be said about kind of who gets to deploy those standards and under what circumstances. Right? At the same time, for instance, that Israel is committing all kinds of human rights atrocities as well and doesn't get in any way sanctioned by any of the exact same international bodies. So I think it is an open question in terms of what are the standards, how do they get applied, who gets to apply them? And I think that's one thing that a lot of people have obviously paid attention to and have kind of noted the kind of continuous hypocrisy in the way that these things get called.
Thank you. We have a question in the front row here.
Thank you for this. I have two questions, actually. The first builds on
Can we keep it to one just for now so we give other people a chance, and if we have time, we'll come back.
So first builds on Abdullah's point about sports being a tool for states and being aided by international sporting governing bodies as a tool to mobilize political agenda. How much of that misses the counter nation branding narrative that's being pushed in the international arena through media and through different platforms? How much of that is reflective of the geopolitical landscape or the international political landscape?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm understanding you correctly, I think it's in some ways, obviously, the way that audiences respond to these things have to do with the broader narratives around what these states are, what they represent. And I think, obviously, in the case of the Middle East, there's a certain kind of association with what each country kind of represents. This obviously points to, as Craig mentioned, for instance, some of the backlash against what's happening in Gulf right now against Saudi Arabia, but also against the Newcastle purchase, against a number of these things, and also in terms of the criticism that we've seen of the World Cup being hosted in Qatar. And to a certain extent, yeah, one could make the case that the branding effort sometimes can backfire, right? That you can put yourself out in a way where you then only subject yourself to greater scrutiny. And a lot of these, again, this goes back to that same question about whether these investments are ultimately worth it, if in the end they're just actually bringing greater scrutiny and criticism and actually defeating the purpose that they're there to kind of normalize the behavior of these countries, and instead they end up actually making them into more pariahs. But again, I think we have to examine on what level that evaluation is being made, because certainly at the level of business, at the level of kind of international and state relations, at the level even of the elite athletes themselves, very few of whom ultimately are talking in favor of kind of boycotting these events. So the events are all going on, the deals are still being made, the corporate sponsors are there, even if they're supposedly giving up some of their tickets. But the actual machinery of these branding exercises continues kind of completely unabated, even if the kind of media narrative tends to seem like there's some criticisms. But I don't know if Craig has.
I would add one nickel. The way these things are always done is there's a lot of critical coverage right up until the event. And then the rights holders take over, the people for whom this is just entertainment. So Fox Sports, BN, you got the rest. And I'm really interested to watch the coverage of the World Cup and what that narrative is. We haven't seen that one yet. And then, of course, is the narrative that comes after, if any, about the legacies, which usually get no attention at all. And so a lot of the legacies that Qatar talks about, I'm interested to see who sticks around for those.
Thank you very much. My name is Irene Theodoropoulou, and I work at Qatar University. Well, I have two questions, actually, one for Niki and one for Abdullah and Greg.
Can we keep it just to one for now?
Sure, the one for Niki is the following. Niki, you mentioned the role, actually, of sports governing bodies as, facilitators in terms of allowing women's voice to be heard. But I was wondering, actually, whether there have been attempts in Iran for women to sort of take advantage of media institutions as well. And what I had in mind, actually, it's pretty advanced as a thought, but I was thinking that maybe, Iranian women could take advantage of being as a medium, and maybe, they could try to mobilize that medium in order to have their voice heard. But if being is such an ambitious target, if you will, I was wondering whether there are any other Iranian media tycoons or any other media all over the world that Iranian women have been trying to approach in order to have their voices heard.
Well, thank you for that question. It gets a little bit complicated because there are, in fact, other media outlets that are very interested, Persian language media outlets, that are very interested in covering this issue. The problem, the complication comes from the fact that those media outlets themselves are state affiliated. So the most professional of those outlets would be the BBC Persian, which gets funding from the Britain Home Office. And then you have Iran International, which is relatively new on the scene, which gets Saudi funding. And there's another channel, Manoto TV. Unclear where the funding of that comes from, suspected to be from Israel. So there are a lot of other state agendas at play when it comes to the women's rights issue in general. And so it becomes there's a lot of vulnerabilities for Iranian women who want to appear on these stations. They do appear on these stations, but who want to use these broadcasters as a place to, as a main focus for their activism. There is a divide between internal activism, external activism, and what counts as independent activism. And that's also where the involvement of the governing bodies gets complicated as well, because in the recent cases that I was citing in relation to the World Cup allowing women into stadiums, that's largely seen as, of course, a positive development because it was an ask from within Iran by Iranian women. But there are also recent examples, not super recent, in the last decade, when FIFA decided in 2011, for example, to bar Iranian women football players. So we're talking about the Iranian women athletes. They were not allowed to participate in the final qualifying match for the London Olympics because FIFA said the hijab requirement for Iranian women was in violation of some code or another. And so that was a case in which the women on the team, it was a double whammy. Maybe some of the women on the team didn't even want to wear the hijab or the hijab as was prescribed by their national team, and here they were being prevented by the the governing body of the sport. So I think there was an earlier question about the geopolitical context and how these governing bodies can also become tools of some of that politics. So the politicization of the governing bodies can go both ways, as can the use of these media broadcasts. So I think it's very dangerous, literally dangerous, for women activists because they're playing on a minefield as they try to ask for more rights.
First of all, thank you so much for coming in, taking the time to come and share. My question is particularly a follow-up to Professor Abdullah's point. Small states, they tend to use soft power as a way to achieve their foreign policies. And however, we consider football as a soft power, how can we distinguish whether the state's aim is to enhance sport domestically or achieve its foreign policy using the sport as a soft power?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think if you're thinking in terms of balancing the domestic considerations with the kind of regional aspirations of a number of these states. I mean, I think you kind of have to look at what the intentions are on the basis of what the actual impact of the policies are. So, you know, states that don't have specific or explicit kind of foreign policy goals or agendas for which they're deploying their footballing interests in the service of them, then in that case you can kind of make the case that it's just simple sports for its own sake. I think that's rare, especially in at least the cases that we've been looking at here, given the kind of precarious positions that a lot of these states find themselves in, and the kind of the convenience, right, of football, as we've seen through kind of all of our comments, is a very, you know, lucrative entity, or you know, something that can be deployed in various ways. It can be very tempting for a lot of states, as opposed to just simply treat it as a sport for its own sake. And I think in that sense, we see that the way that states end up ultimately using it is often to serve other kinds of ulterior goals. And again, when we think about the levels of state spending in all sorts of other arenas, right? Why is it that football kind of can take priority over so many other needs like education or health or housing or so many other things that we think about that are very desperately needed in many parts of the world? Not to kind of diminish the importance or significance of culture and its, but the fact that it gets oftentimes prioritized at the expense of kind of more basic fundamental needs that societies have, I think points to some of those other goals.
Add one thing. One of the interesting things, one of the gaps in the literature, as they say, is that when you look at the history of sports, of broadcasting here in the Middle East, all of these countries had state sports channels, and your football was free. And then one day in 2006, you woke up and you had to pay for it, because suddenly Arab radio television had it, Saudis, and now BN has it. These satellite channels are not popular in the rest of the Arab world, where the whole idea was football was something that the state gave you. And that's been preempted. In all of these countries, FIFA requires that certain matches and any match involving your country be aired for free. But it's kind of upset that state policy of providing football to the citizens.
Yeah, when especially on topic of sports washing and topic of sports being used, judges sports being used as a tool for influence, these talks are often ascribed or talked within the context of authoritarian regimes. How much of that democracies are involved in that? We always talk about the sports washing about Qatar, the Middle East, Russia, China, but how much of that next World Cup host is involved in that kind of crime or that kind of allegations?
I don't know, but I think one of the interesting things we've learned since 2010 is that FIFA is run like a mafia organization. So forget all these other countries. If you go look at the Garcia report that FIFA itself commissioned about the 2010, about the 18 and 22 bids, you might recall that they released it in 2015. They chose not to release all of it because all of it was very damning, and everybody who bid for the World Cup tried to bribe FIFA. The Brits, everybody. That's just how it worked. So yeah, to your question, somebody asked, they're non-political? Not any place I know. This is, you know, sports are always political.